자, 그러면 플래너리 세션 1을
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now start plenary session 1.
자, 이번 세션의 발표 주제는
In this session, the theme is basic income in politics and politics in basic income.
앞서 키노트 세션에서 파레스 교수님께서도 말씀을 하셨는데
As mentioned by Professor Van Parijs,
네, 에릭 올린 라이트 교수님을 언급을 하셨는데요.
Eric Olin Wright was a crucial figure in the development of the basic income movement. And Professor Wright talked about 3 conditions for an alternative to become emancipatory. First of all, an alternative has to be desirable. Second, it should be viable. And third, it should be sustainable.
이 지속 가능성 중에서 중요한 부분이
And when it comes to sustainability, political sustainability is crucial. I believe that is going to be central in our discussion and session, exploring the conditions for basic income to be politically sustainable. We have 2 speakers for the session. Let me introduce the speakers first. In fact, we were supposed to have Professor Louise Haagh as one of the speakers, but due to physical constraints, Professor Haagh will be making his presentation in session 7. So we have 2 speakers and a little more time for plenary discussion. So the first speaker is Professor Jurgen de Wispelaere. Please welcome the professor with a big round of applause. Now, he's a political theorist turned public policy scholar. He is now visiting professor at the Wispelaere Chair of Economic Policy and Constitutional Theory at the University of Freiburg. He's the founding editor of the interdisciplinary journal Basic Income Studies. Recently, he is reviewing the impact of basic income experiments and examining the role of basic income in emergencies. Let us welcome the professor.
Hello. Okay, good. You can hear me. Thanks very much to Chair for a lovely introduction. At least I hope it was a lovely introduction. I genuinely have no idea, but I assume as much. I was asked to talk about the politics of basic income. So I have a paper with a very complicated title, Basic Income Trials Assuring Continued Political Commitment. That takes a lot of digesting, which is perhaps, a bit heavy just after lunch, but I will promise I will try and keep it as light as possible. So let me start by adding to many of the speakers this morning by congratulating the organizers and everyone who is involved in setting this up. We are only at the start of the event, and I think we can already see the amount of work that has been put into, from the people conceiving it, the LOC, to the many volunteers, I'm sure, who are around helping out in so many ways. So very much appreciate that. And I'm really delighted that I've been invited to be up here to talk to you. So I flew in all the way from the south of Chile, which is a 40-hour travel and a 40-hour travel back to give a 20-minute talk. So I calculated it's 240 minutes travel for every minute I get to talk. So that's a first for me. But here we are, and I'm very much enjoying it. So, okay. So let's start with a puzzle. So I'm basically going to be talking about the basic income trials because they are still continuing the most interesting actual practical thing that is happening in basic income world. Very controversial, it generates a lot of debate, rightly so, but still very much practically speaking in terms of realities, the most fascinating things. The puzzle I want to talk about is a political puzzle. The puzzle is the following. In my view, basic income experiments, pilots, trials are very much political phenomena. They are political projects And most of them come into being because at some point there has been a political initiative. Some political actor basically decided to do this and managed to put it on the table. And even those that are private experiments, if you like, or private trials, at some point they will have to engage with politics in order to become policy. So politics really is there all the time. It's the start, if you like, of these basic income trials. Oh, I actually forgot to put my timer on. There you go. That's a couple of spare minutes just for me. At the same time, these basic income trials often fail in various ways for political reasons, either because there's lack of continued political support or because there is active political interference. So the question I'm interested in, which I think is really an important question and we should be taking, in a sense, engaging with much more explicitly, much more involved, is why and how to protect basic income trials from politics itself. So we start with politics, but the moment we have them going, we want to protect them from politics. So a little analogy, since Philippe piloted scientific surveys in the earlier session. So here is a survey for you. Who here has teenage children, daughters or sons? Teenage. Okay, who has been a teenager? Let's do it this way. Right, so it's, you know, with surveys, it's all about asking the right questions, right? So then you will appreciate the following. Teenagers usually really like to have their parents around when they go shopping, right? With the credit cards. That's when they like the parents. The moment the credit card has been used, they really want to keep the parents away because it's very embarrassing. Parental interference is a problem for a teenager apart from the shopping mall. This is how I see basic income experiments, right? I think basic income experiments is about getting the credit card from the politicians, right? Getting all the resources and then trying to keep them away as much as possible. So that's very much what I want to talk about and see how that goes. So sorry, still trying to work this thing here. Yeah. So I have 4 cases. I'm going to be very brief. I just realized that this is, you know, I tried to use, you know, I used a reference of a movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which turns out to be from 1966, and perhaps half the people here haven't even heard of it. But it's a really good movie, spaghetti western, Sergio Leone. You should watch it. Unfortunately, it only has 3 main characters, so I had to find the 4th one from some other type of you know, film type of setup. So very briefly, 4 cases. First, Finland, the good. Why the good? Because Finland actually managed to initiate an experiment, right? At some point, the government initiated the experiment and it ran, right? It ran for 2 years as it was planned. There's a lot of misconception there. A lot of people think that it got canceled. That's not the case. It ran fine, it was evaluated, a public report was published, and that's it. This is not to say that it was perfect. There was a lot of problems. For example, there were problems with the tax authorities trying to figure out how to deal with this. There was a problem trying to, in a sense, expand the project. There was quite a lot of debate about expanding the project beyond its current scope and to extend it beyond the 2 years. And that was resisted by politics. So even in the good case, Finland, we have political factors restricting what's going on. Second case, the bad, Catalonia. A case that, well, one, we have Aida Martinez here who will be talking more about this, but also it's a case that probably people here have heard about because it's much more recent. So what happened in Catalonia, in short, is that the Catalan government decided to pilot with basic income, set up a separate office, but then unfortunately in the recent parliamentary budgetary vote, the budget itself got voted down. Of course, there's a lot more details around this, but I'm going to have to skip fast. So Catalonia is bad because at the moment it's defunded, but interestingly, the office that, you know, there's still people, they're actively working on the design and the implementation. And the hope is that, in a sense, in the future, we can get the budget back. Third case, the ugly, Ontario, another case that people are familiar with. So Ontario, the province in Canada, famously also initiated a basic income type of pilot, but then elections happened and the new government canceled it very, very abruptly. Why ugly? Because they canceled it despite explicit promises during the election campaign that they were going to keep it. And also very ugly because ultimately there were a lot of people there who actually had planned their lives around receiving 3 years of basic income, and suddenly this was cut short. So that's the very, very ugly case. At the moment in Ontario, this has all sort of turned down, basically. All of this has been reduced to basically nothing in terms of actual piloting. The sneaky one, Ireland. So Ireland is a really, really interesting recent case. So like Finland, we had a government plan, a government program setting out a basic income pilot, and a couple of things happened. The first thing that happened is that a minister of the arts quite independently decided to pilot a project for the arts. This was actually not supposed to be, this is not the project that was agreed in the basic income program, sorry, in the government program. This was supposed to be a much larger project, which was, run by a very, very different ministry. The other thing that happened is, in Ireland, they had a very strange coalition agreement where, after 2 years, the prime minister would basically swap with another party. And what happened is a new minister became responsible for the pilot, saw that the arts pilot was already going on, and decided to cancel the main pilot. Why sneaky? Because he actually never told anyone, right? So this literally in Ireland, a lot of people were wondering what's actually going on here. It's only because there was a parliamentary question that the minister said, no, we're not going to do this. There was never any big announcement, never any fuss. So all of this is sort of happening underneath. And many people at the moment think that the arts pilot is the one that the government agreed to, but that's not the case. So we have 4 cases: good, bad, ugly, and sneaky. This looks like very, very different types of cases, right? One completed, one partially ongoing, one temporarily halted, one permanently canceled. So one of the questions is, can we find any common ground underneath this? I think yes. The common ground is a problem, a common problem of political interference, right? It's effectively politics that plays out in different ways, but affected each of these cases. And we can think of political interference in many different ways, right? This can involve blocking, it can involve reversing, it can be sort of more weak type of outcomes, or it can be strong outcomes, right? So it looks very different, but underlying this really is a very common issue. So why do we, in a sense, have political interference in basic income pilots? So one of the things to realize is that politics really is about 2 types of pressures always happening. First one, we have internal pressures. In most of these cases, we have pre-existing political tensions that just play out over time. If you think about a basic income pilot, at a minimum, you're talking 4 years. A year of planning, minimum 2 years of running, a year of evaluation. It could be more, but minimum 4 years. 4 years is a long time in politics. If there are internal tensions in a government or in a coalition, this is going to play out over time. Secondly, the world doesn't stand still. A lot of things are going to happen. So externally, for example, we had the pandemic, right? As one of the major events, we have the war in Ukraine at the moment. We have inflation. A lot of major events are happening, and these political events, these shocks are going to have an impact as well. Some people say the biggest problem with this is that we can't trust politicians, we can't trust politics. Actually, I think that's wrong. We can absolutely trust politics to be political, right? You just need to understand what politics is about. So one of the key features is political processes don't just roll out automatically. It's not because you start a pilot that we can then just trust that everyone thinks gonna roll out. No, politics will intervene, events will happen, processes will play out in all sorts of complicated ways. So we should trust political context to change in ways that's also gonna change priorities. Secondly, we can also trust political actors. We can trust politicians to be politicians, to respond to political incentives, to respond to political motivations, and basically to respond to political events in ways that, for example, is going to further their future in terms of elections, their reputations, their parties, and so on and so forth. So none of that should be surprising, right? The moment we have the proper understanding of what politics is about, we can absolutely trust it. And we can trust it that politics is going to matter when we do pilots, when we start running them, designing them, and so on and so forth. So that leads us then to the next point. Fundamentally, once we have the idea that politics matters, that political interference is a problem, the key question we have is, how do we ensure long-term political commitment? So we have commitment from the start. Each of these pilots somehow had political actors committing to starting them. How do we make sure that that commitment plays out over the whole lifetime of a project? So two things we need is we need political commitment. We need political actors to be willing. We also need them to be able to provide commitment, right? Both of these are very fragile features, right? Because willingness changes, because political motivations, people respond differently to priorities. Ability can also change. I mean, if elections happen and a new party comes into power, you know, ability basically has fully changed. So we have vulnerability, we have fragility on each of these features. So the key thing then to keep in mind is that we should trust political priorities to change. We should trust politics to affect commitments over time, and we need to find solutions on how to get this political commitment. And in one way to think about it is political commitment in this sense is about protecting the basic income trials from politics itself. This is where the teenager stuff comes in. Okay, this is about how can we make sure that the politicians don't mess it up. So two types of solutions. The first one are political solutions. We have a political problem, therefore we should have a political solution. This in effect is what a lot of people have been doing in response to what's happened in Finland, in Ontario, in Catalonia, more recently in Ireland. So what we have is people trying to use political solutions, political mechanisms to deal with a political problem. So there's three different ways this can play out, and I think each of these three has problems. The first one is to basically rely on something like trust and moral, rational persuasion. In effect, this is people saying, look, politicians are trying to ruin our trial if we only explain it to them properly. If they finally understand what basic income really can do, what this trial really can do, they will change their mind. Basically, that's never happened, right? Politicians, just explaining it to politicians, thinking that they're going to change their mind, that's not how politics works. I think that's a very naive way of thinking about politics itself. A second option is mobilizing political pressure, public pressure. In a way, this is what happened in Catalonia. For example, it's happened in Ontario as well. So then suddenly we all get involved in writing opinion pieces, right, in newspapers. Many here actually in the Catalan case have been involved, myself included, in trying to do this. We're trying to mobilize political pressure through the media, directly contacting politicians, their electors, the voters rather, and so on and so forth. There's problems here as well. Yes, we see a lot of public support for basic income in public opinion polling, but that's a very, very different thing from getting people to come on the street to protest against the fact that the pilot has been cancelled. I mean, you know, a pilot such as, for example, the Finnish one or the Catalan one, we're talking about, you know, 5,000 people being affected, 2,000, 5,000. This is not the sort of thing that brings people massively on the street. This is not the sort of pressure that's going to, you know, importantly change people's mind because they feel the pressure, right? Relatedly, for example, I remember in the Catalan case, several people told me, well, the politicians have voted against it now, but they will feel it in the next election. I mean, clearly that's not happening either, right? Simply because while basic income itself, once it's in place, will affect a lot of people, and possibly has this sort of effect, the pilots are very, very small, right? They're not doing the same sort of thing. And then what about bargaining? Bargaining is the third obvious way to use a political solution. Well, what do we have to bargain with? This is the biggest problem we have, right? I mean, basic income is a really, really interesting idea. We're trying to do a lot of work with it. But how can we use something like basic income in a bargaining position? It's not very clear. So one example in Ireland, so the Green Party was one of the initiators of the Irish experiment. Did they in any way react to the fact that the main experiment was being cancelled? No. Why not? Because within the government, they also have other priorities. Oh, sorry. Within the government, they had other priorities, which means, for example, in the Irish case, climate change is the biggest thing. So when the Green Party has to choose between, look, we're going to raise a big stink in the coalition because they cancel the pilot, or we're going to continue with our climate change policy agenda, they basically opted for the first one. The climate change was the bigger one. So this is the problem of bargaining. So three ways in which we can think about political solutions, but none of them, I think, really work very easily. Second set of solutions. So political solutions problematic. What about institutional solutions, or what I call very briefly institutional solutions? So the key thing here is political solutions are reactive. They are exposed. Some problem has already happened, and then we get into action. Institutional solutions is about finding a proactive solution, ex ante. Now, within the basic income debate, we know a lot about the advantages of ex ante versus ex post. So just use the same logic to think about this in terms of solutions. So the point about institutional solutions is we use the processes, we use the rules, we use the regulations to try, in a sense, in advance, protect the pilot already from potential influence from politics or potential control from politics. So, for example, we want to minimize political influence over time, right? So one way in which this can happen is if you're thinking about key appointments in the process, you know, who's going to run the project, make those appointments in advance as opposed to allowing politicians to influence this over time. That's going to reduce your political influence. Effective barriers to political control. So we basically want to have so-called veto points. We want to take out some of these decisions out of the politics. So one way in which this could happen is if, say, for example, the budget somehow is taken out of the political decision. The problem in Catalonia was that we had a parliamentary vote on the budget. If there was a way, and I do say if, it's not always possible, but if there was a way to take the budget decision out of the parliamentary control, we would have protected it that way. Guarantees access to resources is a key thing, and the key point here is guaranteed resources over the whole duration of the pilot. Again, you know, a year planning, 2 years or more running, a year of evaluation. We have too many examples where we have resources for only part of the prospect, right? So, for example, Mincom back in the days, in the 70s, very famously, they ran the experiment and then the money ran out and there was never an evaluation, right? So these are the sort of problems that we need to try and resolve through institutional solutions. So one of the key lessons here is that means the moment we're talking about convincing politicians to run a pilot, we need at the same time try to convince them to protect this pilot, right? All the work has to be done at the very beginning. Not let's just run with it and try and figure this stuff out as it goes along. It's too late. How am I doing for time? Oh, I have a few more minutes. So 4 areas in which this institutional commitment plays out. If you think of, you know, what I said before, so politics doesn't really work, institutional process type of things are more promising, what are the sort of areas that we need to focus on? I think there are 4, there may be more, but I think these 4 are important. The first one is the form of the initial commitment. It makes a difference whether your pilot or your trial is started because some individual minister makes an announcement versus having it actually enshrined in a government program, which is basically an agreement between coalition partners, right? But even there, we can go further, because in the Finnish case, for example, if you look at the government program of the Finns, a lot of commitments were elaborated in a full paragraph. There was one line about the basic income. It was basically the government is committing to do a basic income pilot. That doesn't give any detail. That means it leaves a lot of discretion on how to build it up. So you can think of government programs as a good device, but you want to have more detail in it, if that's possible. The more you can fix in advance, the less discretion later on, the less possibility for influence and control and interference. Budget is a very obvious one. Everyone talks about the budget, right? We need to make sure that the budget is secured. Without the budget, this thing is not going to run. It's not going to fly, okay? Here again, budgets are done very, very differently in different countries, right? In some cases, we have a single budget. In many other cases, we have complex budgets. The Catalan example is really, really interesting because the budget for the office that still exists is very separate from the budget from the running the pilot itself. So the running the pilot itself was subject to parliamentary control. The running of the office isn't. So here you have two separate budgets running in a very, very different way. So you can think of different ways in which you can use this to protect. Oh my God. Two other key factors. Who runs the project, who runs the show is really, really, really important, okay? Again, a lot of big differences here. So the Ontario case, the one that got cancelled, everything was internal within the department. As soon as there was a new election, everything was shut down, literally, you know, with one phone call, so to speak, right? All that happened is one minister had to call and say, look, we're done with this. Everything got shut down. If, however, as in Catalonia, the office is separate, you know, the people who are running it is separate, that gives an important level of protection. So we can think of how this plays out in different countries. Finally, we also need to think about whoever runs the show, they have to collaborate with a lot of agencies, right? In many cases. So for example, think about implementation. Like, you know, if you run a pilot across the country, you need to think about who do we have to collaborate with to actually implement, right? The same with evaluation. If you need to have access to particular data, it's not just surveys, it's registration data. Who owns this data? Who has access to it? How easy is it to get access to it? One of the biggest problems here is that a lot of these agencies are often politically controlled as well, right? The people who head these agencies may or may not be in favor of basic income or the pilot. They may or may not be of the same political party of the government, and so on and so forth, right? So those sort of complications, again, we need to take very, very seriously. So we have four very, very specific points here. Form of initial commitment, budget, who runs the show, and anything to do with external interaction, collaboration. And in each of these cases, separately, we can try and find ways within what's possible within the country, right? Because countries have very, very different rules on a lot of these things. So whatever is possible, try and protect your trial as much as possible from the very, very start in each of these factors, okay? By way of conclusion. So 4 key points, really. So this is very much, you know, this is sort of a story of inviting everyone to think about this, right? To really take it seriously and think about it. But I think a couple of really headway things. First of all, UBI trials really are political events. There is no escape from politics. So all the attempts to try and privatize trials, I think utterly fail, because at some point, if basic income wants to become policy, it's going to interact with politics. So we might as well appreciate from the start, this isn't just about science, this isn't just about demonstration, this is really policy development politics. Interference at some point is unavoidable, political interference in the sense that, you know, events are going to happen, priorities are going to change, politicians themselves are going to have to respond for it, etc., etc. So vulnerability to this political interference is a key factor. The key challenge within that is really securing long-term commitment, not just initial commitment. And the way to do this, as much as possible, is to try to do it ex ante rather than ex post. So don't just rely on our political ability to mobilize people, to bargain, to persuade people once we already ran into problems. Try as much as possible to think of ways of protecting this in advance. Thank you very much.
네, 유르겐 교수님의 아주 익사이팅한 발표 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for the exciting presentation that you gave us. Please give him a big hand. And that was about
없는 이유와
UBI pilots and how they can be inevitably vulnerable to politics and what alternatives we can seek. Thank you very much for your message. And listening to your presentation, well, I thought that meant a lot for the Korean case as well.
제가
Maybe we can talk about this later in the discussion session. We will give each presenter 30 minutes, and for 1 or 2 minutes on the basis of presentation, well, if there is anything that you need more, if you need more clarification, then we can spend 1 or 2 minutes to get feedback or response from Jurgen before we turn to Professor or Mr. Kang Namhoon. So listening to the first presentation, do you have any questions, comments? Do you need any clarification?
네, 다음 발표가 기대된다.
Seems like you're excited to see the next presentation. Then let us directly move on to the next presentation.
님 소개를 간단하게
Let me introduce Professor Kang.
한국 네트워크를 공동 창립했고
He co-founded the Basic Income Korean Network in 2009 and served as its first chairperson. He's the author of The Economics of Basic Income, Political Reform in Basic Income, and the Political Economy of the Information Revolution. In the 2022 presidential election, he participated in the creation of candidate Lee Jae-myung's Basic Income Pledge. He is currently the policy director of the Basic Society Committee of Democratic Party and chair of Basic Society. Recently, he's been conducting research on the topics of carbon neutrality and basic income, which is his presentation theme today. Please welcome Professor Kang. For international participants, I'm going to use my PowerPoint in English, but speak in Korean for the Korean audience. So, what is the role of basic income to achieve carbon neutrality? That's the question of my presentation. So, the Moon Jae-in administration committed to achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 and committed to increase the share of renewable energy to 30% by 2030. However, the current Yoon administration announced an amendment to the commitment to reduce the share of renewable energy to 21.6% by 2030 and is suppressing the renewable energy industry. So if the economy of South Korea is going to decline, this failure to increase the share of renewable energy will be central. So why are we lagging behind in terms of energy transition? You can refer to this news article outlining the expert discussion took place recently. So the experts were saying that the Moon administration's carbon neutrality plan was impossible to realize, nor Yoon administration's neutrality plan. So according to those experts, Korea doesn't have enough sunlight, it Korea doesn't have enough land. Land is too expensive, and
세금 걷는 건 너무 싫어한다. 우리는 왔다 갔다 하는
the Korean public is absolutely against raising taxes.
한국에서 가장
We cannot accomplish it because of politics. We have no choice but to adapt to global warming. So these are the discussion of so-called experts. However, if we fail to achieve carbon neutrality, the subsequent generations will bear enormous damage. The Korean economy will be excluded from international trade, and Korean companies will have to move abroad due to lack of renewable energy sources. And the Korean economy will fall on the path of decline.
예를 들어서 이 멘탈 모델이라고 하는 것은 이
Now, let us take a look at the mental model.
로마 클럽에서 이렇게 성장의 한계를 쓸 때 썼던 시스템 다이내믹스 방법론 중에 하나.
Now, this term is borrowed from the system dynamics of the Club of Rome.
모델을 바꾸지 않으면 사회를
So, what's important is to change the mental model to really change society. So let's take a look at the mental models regarding, first of all, global warming. So it won't be a big problem while I live. It'll be solved by nuclear power or new technology. Our carbon tax increase is a loss to me because it lowers my real income. And if fossil fuel subsidies are reduced, my real income will decrease, which is a loss to me. Now, in Korea, fossil fuel subsidies are huge.
사적 소유고
So the mental model on land. Land is private property, not commonwealth. If a solar power plant is built near my land prices will fall, which is a loss to me.
그다음에 정부가 갖고 있는 정신
So
모델.
regarding the government budget, the mental model is we must maintain a balanced budget always. Government debt should be repaid like an individual's debt. Government debt is a burden on future generations.
정신 모델들을 바꾸지 않으면
So we need to change these mental models to really achieve societal
이게
change.
시스템 다이내믹스에서 나오는 분석인데
Now, this is also what I borrowed from the system dynamics.
이렇게 파란색 선은 이렇게 한쪽
So this diagram shows the causal loop
다른 게 계속 커집니다.
in our economic system.
그다음에
So there are
정선으로
blue and red arrows.
다른 쪽이 작아지는
So the blue arrows show
있는데요. 이걸 읽는 방법은
a relationship where both elements reinforce each other, and the red arrows show that the two elements are moving to the opposite direction.
감소하는 거고요. 이 빨간색 선이 없거나 짝수게 있으면 강화되는 거거든요. 그럼 여기에
And when you have an even number of red lines, it indicates a reinforcing loop. And an odd number indicates a balancing loop.
근데 이 정책을 돌다 보면
So,
이렇게 마이너스 3개가 나와서 이 지지가 떨어집니다.
support for net zero policy leads to an odd number of lines, which means less support.
그 지지가
And
정책의
carbon tax also leads to less support
해야 되는데 이 시스템을
after going through the loop. So how do we fix this system? In other words, how do we change the system in a way that support for carbon tax
이 한국
increases after going through the loop?
의 변화인데요. 이건 클럽입니다.
Now the international trade regime is changing,
협약이 아니라 이 클럽의
largely due to the climate club. Now, this is not like the Paris Agreement. It is a voluntary scheme, and the centerpiece of it is carbon tax.
매길 때
For example, the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the European Union.
분명히 뺄 겁니다. 그렇게 했는데 이 탄소세를 기준으로 일정 이상 탄소세인 나라만 무역을 허가하는 것이죠.
So the climate club would only allow countries with a sufficient carbon tax regime to trade.
일반 관세를 매기자 탄소세가 아니라 이렇게 주장하고 있습니다.
If a country does not have a carbon tax, it'll be subject to carbon tariff or even a general tariff.
그렇게 하고
Now, the G7 has already agreed to creating such a club
미국은 어떤 나라들은
in
어떤 나라들은 대통령의
December last year.
2035년까지 전기 부분에 있어서
And when it comes to the climate
라고 선언을 한
trade system, the governments of Germany, the UK, and the US all declared on power sector decarbonization by 2035. So, immediately after the end of the Yoon administration,
이제는 커다란
the Korean economy will be devastated by these moves by climate clubs across the world.
기간이지만 2035년까지 차기 정부가 시작된다고 할 때
So, when we have a new administration,
해서
how can we make
탄소를
sufficient investment
합니다.
in power sector decarbonization by 2035 at least?
공공 부분에서 제
The question is how much investment is needed.
공공 부분에서 한 300.
According to my estimate, 300 trillion won in public sector and 100 trillion won in the private sector.
자본 중심으로 전환된다면
And if this investment is led by the private capital, there will be a lot of problems.
독점 가격으로
Private capital will
탄소세가 올라갈 때마다
monopolize the energy sector
됩니다. 그래서
and enjoy windfall profits, leading to even more rent seeking and more severe inequality.
그래서
This type of energy transition is not desirable. So the solution I suggest is to issue climate bonds.
한국 정부는 정부 채권을
The government issues zero interest bonds and the central bank buys them.
그렇게 되면
This is very much feasible according to current laws.
채권자들에게
And profits from the issuance
정당화되는 이유는
of the climate bond should belong to the sovereign, which means all people.
채권자에는 훨씬 더 작은 비용 미래 세대의 부담을 줄이는
And it can be justified on the grounds that climate bonds reduce cost for future generations. The sooner we achieve this, the faster we reduce future costs. We can use an analogy of war, as mentioned earlier. Now, this is a global war which
제로의 그린백을 발행해서
surpasses the severity of the American Civil War. And as some of you may well know, Lincoln issued government bonds to fund the Civil War.
예산은 기후 채권을 발행하자 이런
So my suggestion is to achieve power sector decarbonization by 2035 by financing with climate bonds.
독일에서 2020
And one other measure is mandatory land use designation.
국토의 2%를 의무적으로
There is a German example, the Onshore Wind Energy Act, where each state has to ensure that 2% of its land area is covered by onshore wind by 2032.
배정하더라도 할당하더라도
Now, my suggestion is to designate 1% of land area and 1% of sea, because we have more sea area compared to Germany, per municipality for renewable energy generation. If
자발적인 거래가 이루어지도록 하자라는 게
there is a violation of this
탄소세와 탄소
designation, municipalities may be subject to fine or penalty.
노벨 경제학상 수상자 중
Now, moving on to carbon tax and dividend. There are many advocates, including Nobel
세의 주자
laureates.
중에 제가 주목하고 싶은 것은 공정성과 정치
At the center of this suggestion is fairness and political sustainability.
배당을 나누자라고 하는 겁니다. 이때 공정성
It is guaranteed by the carbon dividend scheme.
하는 걸로 저는 해석을
By fairness, it means energy transition should not decrease fairness. And by political stability or political viability, we need to make sure that the majority of the people should benefit from the carbon tax.
이 탄소 배당을 해야 되는 이유는 특히 한국에서는
So to explain a little more on the need for carbon dividend, In Korea, we have a lot of fossil fuel subsidies,
한국전력의
and the public corporation called KEPCO now has an accumulated deficit of $200 trillion, which come from the fossil fuel subsidies, allowing people and businesses to use electricity cheap. And we need to raise electricity rates 4 times.
지금부터 바로 배당하지 않으면서
And that can be done by carbon tax. And without distributing that carbon tax as dividends to all people, it is not politically viable.
요금을 올려야 된다. 이것이 이제 이 탄소 배당의 필요성이 되겠죠.
So this is
그러면서
how
이 로마 클럽에서
carbon dividend can be levied and distributed.
했습니다.
Now, that
모두를 위한
is in line with the argument of the Club of Rome.
한 사람만 주지 않고 모두에게 기본소득을
So let me quote from
이 탄소 중립으로 가는
the book
세계인들의 모두가
Earth for All. You might ask, wouldn't it be fair to just give the dividend to the least well-off in society? It is important to bring everyone in society on this journey, or it risks failing.
이 필요할 뿐만 아니라 그것만으로 안 된다라는 설명이 되겠습니다. 제가 시계가 안 보이는데
However, carbon dividend is not sufficient. So I have 11 more minutes. Right, it's going to be enough. We need additional schemes. Now, let me explain this model.
그래도 되고요.
So the horizontal axis is the electricity we need, and the vertical axis on the left is fossil
걸로 이렇게
fuel
해놨습니다. 그래서 재생에너지는 원점이 저쪽인데
production, and the vertical axis on the right is renewable energy production.
재생에너지는 뭐 태양,
And as you see, there are different supply curves.
가격 차이가 크기 때문에
When it comes to renewable energy, the production cost is diverse depending on whether that's solar power or wind power or onshore or offshore.
재생에너지로 발전하는 게 맞겠습니다. 현재 균형 상태가 그런 상태입니다.
So here you see the current equilibrium of E0 on the right side.
C0, C2만큼 이렇게 탄소세를 먼저 C1만큼 C0, C1만큼 탄소세를 부과하면
So if the government starts levying carbon tax and
재생에너지가
the new equilibrium will become E1,
더 유리하니까
for example,
원점에서
which means
예, 재생에너지 발전은
that
이게 탄소세를 부과하는
the production of fossil fuel and renewable energy will find a new equilibrium, which will accelerate
이 밑에 있는
energy transition. And the problem is that
OR이라는 이 직사각형만큼만 에너지 가격을 지불했는데
in the past, the energy prices that had to be paid was the area surrounded by OC, CO, DO, and OR. However, with carbon tax, the prices to be paid increases. The area will be surrounded by OC, C1, D1, and OR.
상당한 부분을 탄소세 수입으로 충당할 수 있고 이 탄소세 수입을 탄소 배당으로
And
상당히 적어도 중산층과 저소득
in that increased, and the much of the increased prices will be carbon tax, which is new revenue that can be the area surrounded by C0, C1, T1, and T0, which means a huge share of the new revenue can be distributed to people as carbon dividends and may be invested back for energy transition.
그래서 탄소세 수입은 요거밖에 차지하지 않게 됩니다. C0, C2, E2, G만큼의. 그래서 모든 지출의 아주 일부만 탄소세 수입으로 충당되기 때문에 설령 탄소세 수입을 100% 배당하더라도 대부분의 중산층의 실질 소득 저하는 피할 길이 없습니다. 그러니까
So that was the scenario where the carbon tax is raised to the level of C1. And if the carbon tax is raised even higher to C2, the new equilibrium will be E2, and the carbon tax will represent only a small portion of the prices to be paid, which means that the majority of the middle class will actually lose even if they receive carbon dividends. So this is not politically viable.
자들의 이득이 됩니다. 이것을 좀 자세하게 설명하기는 어렵지만
But we need to consider one more thing, the profits for the renewable energy businesses.
유리한 곳에 입지한 어떤 그런 업체들은 막대한 이윤을
They benefit from the new carbon tax regime, and if they are located in an advantageous location, they can achieve windfall profit. That is why if those renewable energy businesses are monopolized by financial capital, they will actually worsen inequalities. So I believe that at least 2/3 of the new renewable energy business have to be publicly run
할지라도 정부가
or
투자해서
collectively managed by cooperatives, for example.
그 지분으로 그것을
Or the government can make an investment
불평등을
with the contribution of people
주장이 되겠습니다.
and distribute the equity, distribute the profits to people based on their equity.
소득 배당이 필요하겠습니다.
So,
탄소 배당은 필요했고요. 공유부 배당, 특히 정부가
carbon tax and carbon dividend are not sufficient for politically viable energy transition. We need other elements as well. Commonwealth dividend,
토지 가치세를
for example,
토지 배당을 함으로써
as I explained, and we also need land value tax and land dividend. With that, we can secure land for renewable power generation and reduce the cost of renewable energy generation.
참여함으로써
And we can also think of cooperative dividend, where residents of communities can receive dividends according to their equity. And we can also think of neighborhood dividend.
피해를 당하는 것에 대한 보상.
It can be a form of compensation for the sacrifices of local residents who are living nearby power transmission towers and lines.
할때 우리는
The sunlight pension of Sinan County is a good example. So with these 5 schemes, we can more effectively accelerate energy transition.
신안군에서
Now this case of Sinan County will be presented more in detail in one of the sessions this week. But to explain a little bit, the residents of the county are receiving sunlight pension benefits and wind pension benefits.
월 50만 원을 지급할 계획입니다.
And they plan to actually
합친 겁니다.
provide 500,000 won per month. Now, the case of Sinan County is a combination of neighborhood dividend and cooperative dividend because it is mandatory to form cooperatives for renewable energy production in the county. I believe the central government can expand that scheme.
다음과 같이 바뀌어야죠. 그래서
And for that to take place, the mental model should change.
이제 탄소라는 리소스도 주지만 이 생태계는 싱크라는
Now, the air's ability to store carbon is an ecosystem sink service, which is our common wealth.
발달되어 가고 있기 때문에
Now, the sink service is rapidly depleting, so we need to put a very high price tag on the service in order to common that.
탄소 대신에 태양과 바람이라는 우리의 공유부를 이용해야 돼요.
And we need the sun and wind to generate energy without using carbon.
그러나
They are infinite and inexhaustible commons. However, at the same time, they require land, which is a form of scarce commonwealth.
일정 부분을
So we have to remind ourselves of that fact, and
뿐만 아니라 이 에너지 전환에는 막대한
we need to come to a compromise on how to use land.
벗어날 수 있고 정부가 투자를 하는 건 우리의 공유.
And money is our institutional common wealth. So we can and should reduce inequality by utilizing sovereign money to finance energy transition.
일 때
Uh,
바뀌면서 탄소
when we have this perspective, the government can be more actively
그러면은
invest
아까 그림에
in energy transition projects.
해당 기본소득
Now this is a revised system where you see 3 additional dividend schemes.
삭감하죠.
Here,
예, 짝수기
as you go through the loop, support for net zero policy receive even numbers of lines. Not all the elements have even numbers of lines coming back, but
돌아가도록
you can see that overall you will have more support for net zero policy, which means that
소득이 바로
political parties championing this policy can stay in power much longer, allowing for sustainability in the long term.
예, 끝인가요?
So that's it for my time.
조금 더 있었는데
It seems I had a few more slides, but it doesn't work. Right, that's it for me.
네, 강남 교수님 다시 한번
Professor Kang, thank you very much. Please give another big hand for him.
필요성과 현실을
So that was a
주신 것 같습니다.
insightful presentation on the necessity of carbon dividend and how it can be politically feasible. Now I'd like to invite the speakers to the stage for discussion.
네. 네, 아까 말씀드린 것처럼
Well, like I explained, if you have any questions or if you need any clarification for Professor Kang, well, do you have any questions or comments?
땅값이 비싸면 왜 탄소 중립이
Right,
어려워요?
so can you explain more about why carbon dividend is not feasible when land value is high? Now, one element of production of renewable energy is the value of land. Now,
좀 짧긴 하지만
other production elements in Korea are not that expensive compared to other countries, but the land value is like 4 times or 5 times higher than in the United States, which is a disadvantage.
더 많이 드는
Is renewable energy production, requiring more land area? Yes, that is.
질문하실 분? 네,
Any other question?
Thank you. So I have a very short question for the first speaker. You've talked about more UBI pilots, trials, experiments. But what about natural experiments? Like we've had during COVID some proxy policies that you could say in a lot of countries that resemble somewhat universal basic income, less or more universality, less conditionality. Is there anything that we can learn from that? Or are they more shielded against political interference, you think, than the UBI experiments that are specifically designed to test them?
Short question, so short answer. Natural experiments are very, very different by the fact that they occur anyway, and in a sense, ex post, we try to evaluate them in various ways. Of course, there are some of them that we do that would require, say, for example, political funding and so on and so forth to engage with this evaluation, but it's always going to be a different order, I think, from actually putting, a full experiment or a trial or a pilot from the very, very, very start, right? So I think you have less of that issue of you start off with a political commitment to do a pilot, and then you need to think about keeping that going. So different order of magnitude, I think, largely.
네, 네. 짧은 질문 하나만 더 받겠습니다.
We'll take one more short question.
앞에 손 들으셨나요?
So there was a hand in the front.
Thanks both. Question for Professor Jurgen de Wispelaere. I really appreciate it. I mean, the way you are. I mean, we spend a lot of time as advocates and as academics anxious about having trials, experiments, pilots, whatever on UBI, of course. And I mean, we really need the type of discourse that you are defending. But at the same time, I was in my country, in Portugal, at this moment, there are hundreds of trials going on. For example, on the 4 days week. And it's not a big deal. It started, it's going to end, it's going to be approved perhaps. So do you think there's a specificity to UBI which makes it so difficult? Or first part of the question, and second part of the question, can we look into these other trials which are much less polemic and take some lessons from it so that we can find more complete answers to your very pertinent questions? Thanks.
Thanks, Roberto. Yeah, those are actually really, really good points. So, of course, in Finland as well, there's a whole cultural experimentation. So they've been doing experiments about other things as well. And yes, they are very, very different because they're much, much less controversial. So yes, there is something about basic income that really grabs the imagination and that causes the controversy, right? So, and we see this in terms of general policy development. I mean, I often tell people we should start looking at basic income as a policy the same way we think about healthcare, the same way we think about education or transport. But basic income is much more controversial than whatever transport and so on and so forth. So there is that. At the same time, I mean, yes, we can learn from this. So I think that would be really a very, very good idea. So look at what, if anything, problems might have arisen in some of these other pilots and see how people can get round to it and try and use the same mechanism. So absolutely, I think we should learn as much as possible. One key feature here, something I skipped over way too fast, context matters. So in some countries, the controversy is going to be a lot less, the political interference is going to be a lot less, but also the mechanisms by which they can be protected are going to be very, very different. So learn from the ground and then see how we can scale that up and so on. Absolutely.
네, 감사합니다. 파리스 교수님께서
Thank you very much. We have Professor Van Paris raising his hand.
Yeah, Professor, a question for both Professor Kang. I was interested by your discussion of climate clubs, and so you mentioned the European Union CBAMs, but you also mentioned that something happened last December, and in connection with climate clubs, and I couldn't quite understand what happened. And more generally, is there anything like climate clubs taking shape in this part of the world? And so if you could say a bit more about that.
예, 그 자세한 걸 이렇게 내용을 본 건 아니고요.
So, well, I didn't have a lot of detailed information. I just referred to news articles. So according to news, in the right aftermath of the G7 meetings last November, a document was released by a German minister, which says the G7 agreed to create a climate club without much details provided.
논문은 몇 년 전부터
You know, the term climate club itself is well known from a few years ago. First proposed by Nordhaus. Now, the G7 last year was not the first incident where climate club was discussed. I think the German government has been persuading G7 for several years. Now, the proposal of Nordhaus is to
하는 조건으로
impose conditions to countries with a carbon tax rate under a threshold, which would be imposing a certain rate of additional tariff for all international traded goods.
그 참고 문헌을 좀 달아서
So
슬라이드를 보충해서
I am going to update my slide with the references regarding this and share with you later.
Well, to Jurgen, you have chosen 4 examples that were not so successful. But why didn't you include the successful example that exists of a citizen's basic income for already more than 40 years that has moved Alaska from the most unequal state of the 50 American states, and now today it's the most equal of the 50 American states, and it is considered to be political suicide for any leader there to propose the end of the system. So it functions, it is very successful, and perhaps it's a suggestion for you. The next time, include Alaska. And I would make a suggestion for the next Young Congress that you do invite here the chairman of the Alaska Permanent Fund to tell us what has happened along all those years. Thank you.
Thanks, Eduardo. Well, 2 responses. First of all, Sergio Leone's movies doesn't have the successful, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so I was a bit restricted. But no, but seriously, policies are different from pilots. That's the fundamental distinction. So we're talking Alaska as a policy. We're also talking, for example, Maricao as a policy, right? You could have mentioned that one as well. There are always challenges, but it operates in a very, very different way. The very specific problem of pilots is that, they are these very short-term things. They require quite a bit of investment. They are controversial, and they affect a very small number of people. One of the key features in Alaska is everyone there is affected, right? One of the problems in Maricao, for example, if you were to change that, is that everyone in Maricao would be affected, and so on and so forth. So that dynamic is a very, very different one. The politics of pilots are not the politics of policies. But otherwise, yes, of course, we have success stories, but they're not the pilot success stories.
네, 명쾌한 답변.
Just, Maricao will be a universal basic income experience by the end of, well, after the end of 2024. So it's an important news. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다. 그러면 이제
Right, thank you very much.
발표에 대해서 이해는 어느 정도
I think we have a good understanding of the 2 presentations to some extent. And now let us focus on this, the theme of the session, politics in basic income and basic income in politics for our discussion. So regarding this topic, do you have any comment, question, or suggestion?
받고 저기 전 세계
We're going to collect questions offline
주시면 좋을 것 같습니다.
and online. So for those of you joining us online, you can share your questions.
질문을 받도록 하겠습니다.
First, we'll collect offline questions.
뒤에 계신 분.
We have a hand in the back.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 이원재라고 하고.
Nice to meet you. My name is Lee Won-jae. I am a researcher on basic income. I have a question for Professor Kang regarding financing of basic income.
채권 발행이 이제 만약에
So you talked about
전쟁이나 이런
the issuing of climate bond.
우리 그 구조조정 때 했던 것처럼 그런 식의
So there are some similar cases in the past during the war or in the financial crisis.
많은 힘을 들일 필요가 정치적으로는 없는 거 아닌가?
If that is actually possible, we're going to have a lot less burden on financing by raising taxes. The tax is always challenging in political debate.
네, 질문들 몇 개 받고
We're going to collect some questions first before having the answers. Any other questions?
네, 안녕하세요.
Good afternoon. I'm Han In-jung, a member of the Young Researchers Network. I have a question for Professor Kang as well.
분명히 이제
Now,
에 따라서
there are
사실 다르잖아요. 하신 부분 안에서
different
신재생 에너지를 지역에
different levels of politics going on in municipalities. In that influence of politics varies.
상태였다고 보이거든요. 근데 이런 신재생 에너지가 분명히
And now there were some cases where the communities were actually opposed to renewable projects, even when they were offered a compensation of money like sunlight pension, because they just wanted to sustain their lifestyle. So the fear of communities like that is to lose their way of life in having only the renewable energy production hardwares. So what do you think of that case? And another issue is to include non-human life forms in the carbon dividend or renewable energy production schemes. Any other questions?
네, 반갑습니다. 위르겐 교수님께 질문 드리겠습니다. 저는 기본소득당 오준호 공동대표입니다. 기본소득 실험들에 대해서 다른 나라와 한국의 공통점도 있고 차이점도 있다고 보는데, 공통점은 아무래도 중앙 차원보다는 이제 지방 정부 중심으로 이 실험들이 진행되었다는 것 같고요. 차이점은 한국에서는 사실 실험을 건너뛰고 바로 정책으로 이제 뛰어든 특성이 있습니다. 그렇기 때문에 한국이 기본소득 운동에서 상당히 후발주자였는데 몇몇 사례들에 의해서 좀 세계의 관심을 받을 수
We were lagging behind in terms of BI because in Korea, we skipped the process of pilots and go directly into the policy. So when they're elected, they directly turn to policies where they distribute basic income right away. So this can be an advantage because this can spread the concept of BI quickly, but with different party assuming the office, then they can change positions overnight, and that can mean some setback for policies. But on the other hand, well, is it because we do not have pilot projects? Does it mean that the best way would be go through all the pilot projects meticulously so that we can be better prepared? But also we can see from your presentation that it doesn't always mean that we are fully prepared just because we had pilots. So when it comes to developing policies and gaining political support, well, what would be the best way to do that? So considering the Korean case, do you have any take or advice you'd like to share with Korea?
답변 듣겠습니다. 혹시
We'll take one more question before having the answers.
바로
If there's no other question.
뒷부분에
I see a hand in the back.
드셨습니다. 가능하면 짧게 질문에
Please be brief and go to the centerpiece of your question. I am Park Ji-hoon. I'm a student. I have a question for Professor Kang.
모델 설명해 주신 부분에서 화산별로 같이 얹어서 직사각형 모델에서 설명하신 걸 보고.
So regarding this diagram of the fossil fuel production and renewable energy production.
불평등한 일이 생길 수 있다고 했는데 그러면.
So you talked about the possibility of worsening inequality by raising carbon tax and increasing electricity bills. So what is the optimum balance we need to go for?
네, 감사합니다. 두 분
Thank you very much for the questions. Now we'll have answers from the speakers. So the issue we need to focus on is politics. So I'd like to ask the speakers to focus on politics in your answers. Professor Kang, please go first. Thank you very much for the questions.
이 사실은 없는데요. 없어야 되는데요.
Now, actually, financial limitations
1년 내려
should not exist. Even 1 year of delay leads to
빨리 해야 되는데
additional costs of an order of magnitude, not just one additional year's worth of cost. So we need to start earlier. But the problem is that it's challenging to change people's mental model or people's mindset. For example, the mental model of the bureaucrats in the Ministry of Planning and Finance. They are so much obsessed with this idea of financial balance. And breaking that myth is, I think, one of the most challenging part.
이제 기후 위기입니다. 그래서 가능한 한 있는 그대로 기존의 삶을 살아갈
and there was also a question about community opposed to renewable project. I respect their view of maintaining their lifestyle, and the problem is that because of the climate crisis, you cannot live the same way, and you need to make at least a little bit of adjustment to your lifestyle by establishing renewable projects.
도시에는 안 된다. 도시 땅값.
And we need to reach a consensus on that. How much should change, and where should we establish the renewable projects? So people in urban areas who say that the land value will decrease, and people in rural areas might say that they don't want the landscape to be damaged. If they both stick to their arguments, there's no place for renewable projects. So we need to really reach a consensus and find a way. And I'd like to stress that a failure to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 will lead to extinction of 50% of all life forms on Earth.
없지만 생명들의 일자리 지구를 한 절반쯤 떼주면 좋겠지만 이제
regarding the question of including non-human life forms,
진짜 지구의 절반을 할당할 수 있을지.
I would like to say that the urgency is to achieve carbon neutrality by human endeavor by 2050, and then we can think of considering the other life forms.
I actually don't have my little earpiece, so.
누가 통역 좀 오준호 대표님 질문은 실험을 통역기 있으면 혹시 전달해 주시겠어요?
마이크 없어 영어로 하거나 뭐 좀.
네, 오준호 대표님 간단하게.
So Chairman Oh, would you repeat the question
질문만.
and keep it brief, please?
네. 기본소득 실험을
So regarding the pilots, in carrying out these pilots, there are difficulties and also there are institutional issues. In the case of Korea, well, the municipalities directly jump into policy development instead of having these pilots, and it is helpful in terms of spreading the concepts quickly. So just please keep brief to the point. But with a different party taking office, then that will mean that the policy will change overnight. So how can we strike a balance given the Korean situation?
Okay, thanks very much. I'm very hesitant to say anything very specific about the Korean situation because frankly, I'm here to learn about Korea. I don't know very much about Korea. We had a really interesting seminar with some people at Yonsei University a couple of days ago, and there already we learned a lot about what's going on. So So two things. There are general features, if you like, political factors that will play. So elections happening, new parties coming into government and so on, the coalitions changing, all that will definitely have an impact. The very specifics of that will depend what happens on the ground. And that's where I can't really give you a very informative answer because I just don't know the case very well. I know a lot of the cases in Europe. I'm not sure exactly the very specific political situation in Korea. So but it would be really, really interesting to learn more, in a sense, about what my understanding is. And I've heard one of the speakers this morning talk about how some of these projects now are actually being vulnerable, right? So that some of these projects are really under threat. So it'd be really, really interesting to see which of these projects will be surviving, which of these projects will be having to change or possibly being cancelled. So it'd be really, really interesting to learn what is it about the different projects that has affected their chances for surviving in the Korean context. But I have to say, I don't have any clear tips for you. I don't have any particular answers for you. And that's largely because for me, the Korean case is a very unique case as well. But it's something that I need to learn from. I can't tell you anything about this.
네, 답변 감사드립니다. 온라인에서 질문이 들어왔습니다.
Thank you very much for your answers. We have a question from online.
께서 질문을 하셨는데,
We have a question from Filippo.
네, 마이크 켜시고 질문 부탁드립니다.
Please unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
네.
Yeah.
Yes, we hear you.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I had a question for Professor de Wispelaere. My question is, as completing a government pilot is indeed very complicated, do you see any potential in privately funded, implemented, and evaluated pilots? We are currently evaluating one. So we are looking at the impacts of a basic income project carried by a non-profit organization. And in this sense, my main concerns regard the credibility and attractiveness of research conducted by a non-governmental organization in the eyes of the government, besides the constraints of scale, of course. Just wanted to hear your view on this.
So there are interesting questions about this, the distinction between the private projects and the policy ones. It all depends what you think these private projects are meant to be doing. In my view, at some point, private trials also have to interact with the policy process, at which point they will have to interact with politics. Right, so this is inevitable. I mean, the people who think that we can fully bypass politics, I don't buy that. I mean, then the private trials kind of become a little bit of a gimmicky type of thing. If you want to scale it up as policy, at some point you need to interact, and you're going to face a different set of problems in a way, right? So some of the things you mentioned before, for example, I mean, to what extent what goes on with private information is going to be reliable is one question. The other key feature, I mean, if you think about regular pilots, people often, in my mind, weirdly enough, and I am a scientist, but people focus too much on the science side. So for me, policy pilots, like basic income trials, are two things. They are science projects, they are policy projects directly. One of the problems, for example, in the Finnish case is that the trial there was very much treated by everyone in Finland as a scientific project, which meant that the moment the trial started, discussions stopped, involvement of organizations stopped, politicians stopped talking about it, and 3 years later, after we did the evaluation, suddenly all this information became part of the public debate, but the debate had moved on, okay? That is, to my mind, in Finland, we had a clear missed opportunity. If you think that pilots and trials are part directly of the policy process, you need to keep that involvement going all the way. So in a sense, the private pilots have the same problem. Like, they can do some of the private thing. Of course, they can engage with people in all sorts of ways, but they may not engage directly enough with the political actors that you need at a later stage. So this is my problem with it. So private pilots, bypass some of the problems that I discussed, but they will face a different set of problems the moment they want to scale up into policy. I hope that's some sort of answer to your question.
네, 답변 감사드립니다. 제 시간이 거의
Thank
다
you very much
돼서요.
for your answer.
마지막으로
Well, maybe I think we can take one final question in the interest of time.
네, 이쪽 왼쪽입니다.
So we have a hand on the left side here.
I have a question to follow up, Jurgen, on your last answer. I'm wondering, with all the pilots that you have surveyed, are there any examples of pilots that have navigated the political challenges in the way that you're talking about? Obviously, not necessarily resulting in a basic income being enacted. I think we would have heard about that if that had happened. But any case where you see the political process of getting the pilot going as contributing to the possible future implementation of a basic income?
Okay, thanks very much. That's actually a really, really interesting question because it brings me to a very, very important point. When I was talking about trials failing, we have to make a distinction between the trial failing itself, as in somehow being interrupted, somehow being downgraded, being cancelled, not having sufficient funds so that there's no evaluation and so on and so forth. That's all part of the trial itself. It's a very separate question what happens once this trial is completed and there's reports and what happens in the policy process. Right? I think we need to keep these separate. It would be very odd to say that a trial failed simply because the results themselves then afterwards haven't been picked up. And one reason for that is that it may well be the case that while in Finland at the moment basic income is more or less dead, that's controversial, but in my view it is. It may well be that it gets picked up again in 5 years. So who knows, right? So that's sort of a separate thing. So when I'm talking about political commitment for trials, this is a commitment to really run the trials as it is initially planned and not having that interrupted or corrupted in some sense until the very end. How that then afterwards features into a policy debate, a public deliberation, and so on and so forth, hopefully leading to something like basic income, but perhaps even just changing existing systems more along the way of a basic income, that's a separate thing. Actually, as it happens, I have a project on that very specifically, and we published a special issue of a journal on this very specifically last year. And we're actually finding some very, very subtle changes, right? We are actually finding that even, for example, in the Scottish case, which I haven't mentioned here, but Scotland very famously never did a pilot, but had a feasibility study. If you actually look at what happened there, you can see a big growth on the political movement. That's an important impact of the discussion of a pilot, right? Which is very, very separate on whether a trial itself happened and whether this was interrupted and so on and so forth. So I guess 2 points. One, we need to keep these processes separate. And secondly, there is actually really interesting work to be done, but that's separate from what I talked about the impact, if you like, of pilots and so on and so forth. But to me, those are separate questions.
네, 감사합니다. 아마도
Thank you very much for your answer.
머릿속에서
You can think of more questions as our discussion develops, but in the interest of time, we have to wrap up.
흥미있게 잘
So it was a very interesting presentations and discussion.
들으면서 생각했던 걸 짧게
So
이 세션 마치
let me share with you my thoughts after listening to your questions and answers. So the first speaker talked about pilots, and the question for him was more about the actual policies like that in Alaska. And when you think of Korean examples, the youth dividend in Seongnam was an actual policy, but has ended, and the Gyeonggi Province youth basic income is at a crossroads. So the next step for basic income research is
이런 부분들에 대해서 말씀을 해주시면
can be on the political sustainability for pilot programs and actual policies.
말씀을 많이 하신 것 같아요.
And I think Jurgen talked about the irrationality of politicians mainly, but Professor Kang focused more on the limited rationality of the public in general. So that is the basis of his assumptions about people's behavior regarding the support or opposing of basic income or current dividend schemes.
동안 변화가
So
비합리성을 만나면
what is going to happen when the limited rationality of the public meets the irrationality of politicians? That could be an interesting research question for you experts, because I am the least experienced one on this topic. And lastly, I think Jurgen didn't talk much about the citizens' perspective and attitude toward pilot programs. I think that would be also a crucial determinant of pilot programs. I hope he can also touch upon this issue in your next research.
이번 세션 마치도록 하겠습니다.
That will be the end of the session. Please give another big hand for the speakers.
네, 첫 번째 전체 세션이 종료되었습니다. 지금부터